Do you believe? The film opens with the scripture faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. James 2:17. A voiceover by Pastor Matthew, Ted McGinley, explains that this story is about 12 lives that are going to be affected by the cross and will ask themselves one question: do you believe? Pastor Matthew is driving to pick up J. Lee Majors and his wife Terry, Sybil Shepherd, at the hospital. There we meet Joe, Brian Bosworth, who is waiting to be seen by a doctor. He strikes up a conversation with Lily Moss, a little girl who is homeless, along with her mother Samantha, Mira Sorvino. Samantha sees her daughter talking to Joe and is initially hesitant of him, but starts to trust him after he gives up his spot at the hospital for Lily. After Lily's appointment, she comes back to talk to Joe. Samantha mentions to Lily that the shelter that they were going to stay at is closed. Joe then offers to let them stay at his place for the night. Elsewhere in the hospital, a young woman named Lacey, Alexa Pinavega, is brought in after an apparent suicide. Her doctor, Dr. Farrell, Sean Aston, notices previous cut marks on her wrist and concludes that she probably wouldn't care if she lives or dies. The nurse, Elena, Valerie Dominguez, thinks he's being a bit harsh. Matthew takes Jay and Terry back to their house when he spots a pregnant young woman, Madison Pettis, going through the garbage looking for food. After he drops Jay and Terry off at their house, Matthew goes back and offers to give the young woman, whose name is Maggie, some help. He takes her to his house and asks his wife Grace, Tracy Melchior, if they can take her in, which she objects to. He then takes her to a local motel and prepays for Maggie to stay there a few days to get some rest. Matthew then drives home, but stops after he sees a street preacher, Delroy Lindo, carrying a big cross down the street. The preacher then asks Matthew if he believes in the cross of Christ, to which Matthew says he's a preacher, so yeah. The preacher says that if he believes, what is he going to do about it? At that moment, the preacher spots 4 young men, led by criminal, Senyo Imoku, and his brother Pretty Boy, Shways, breaking into a white van. When the preacher comes up to talk to them, criminal pulls a gun on him. The preacher says that they are only hurting God by what they're doing, but that he is going to pray for them. These words spark something inside Pretty Boy. Criminal then calls the preacher a fool and drives away. The preacher says that he's a fool for Christ. When Criminal asks Pretty Boy why he's so quiet, Pretty Boy wonders about whether there's some truth to what the preacher was saying. The others then laugh at him. Joe takes Samantha and Lily to his place and says that he's going to stay at a friend's house for the night since there's only one bed in his apartment. He then leaves them there for the night. He goes downstairs and finds a bench and goes to sleep. Matthew spends the night contemplating what the preacher said to him. The next day, Joe comes back and Lily tells him about a glass jar in his cabinet that is filled with cash. Samantha tells Lily to put the jar back. Joe tells Lily that it's not the cash that is important. He opens the jar and pulls out a sculpture of an angel that he made himself. He gives it to Lily to play with. While Lily plays, Samantha tells Joe about how her husband died. Joe asks her if she believes in God, to which she responds by asking how God could take her husband away, even after they went to church every Sunday. He offers to let them stay permanently, but Samantha refuses the offer and she leaves with Lily. He then starts coughing violently into a napkin. When he looks into it, there's blood. Lacey wakes up and Dr. Farrell asks her if she meant to inhale the chemicals that caused her to go to the hospital. She replies that it was an accident, to which he says really. He then says that she can go home. When the nurse wheels her outside, there is no one there to pick her up. When Lacey asks the nurse if they got a hold of her father, the nurse tells her that they called, but no one answered. Lacey goes home and calls her father. We hear her tell him that she wishes to see him, despite having resentment toward her stepmother, but he does not wish to see her, leaving her in tears. Carlos, Joseph Julian Soria, is a war veteran who is suffering from post-traumatic stress. He is the brother to Nurse Elena. When she gets home from the hospital, they hug and she offers him a chance to stay there until he finds a place. That night, Pastor Matthew gives a moving sermon about what the preacher said about believing. He leaves a little wooden cross for each of the members of the congregation, which includes Jay and Terry, Joe, Grace, Elena and her husband Bobby, Liam Matthews. At the same time, Criminal, Pretty Boy and 2 others attempt to rob and kill a local drug dealer. Pretty Boy waits in the getaway car, while Criminal and the other 2 drive the stolen white van into the drug dealer's establishment. After hearing gunshots, Pretty Boy, still reflecting on what the preacher said, sees the drug dealer come out of the house but cannot bring himself to kill him, so he lets him go. When Criminal asks him if he saw the drug dealer, Pretty Boy says he didn't. Criminal hands Pretty Boy a red duffel bag full of cash. Pretty Boy asks Criminal what happened to the other two guys that were with them. Criminal says that's the price of doing business, suggesting that the other two guys died in the shootout. With sirens approaching, Pretty Boy and Criminal attempt to escape. When the police corner them in a roadblock, the two take off in different directions, but Pretty Boy has the duffel bag with the cash. Pretty Boy then stashes the cash and continues running with the police still in pursuit. He then runs into the church, where Matthew is giving his sermon. Pretty Boy runs into Joe, who tells him that he's been where he is. Joe tells him that the answer is in there, pointing into the chapel. With the police about to come into the church, Joe leads Pretty Boy into the chapel. Pretty Boy sits down and picks up a little wooden cross. He then prays to God that he won't be found. A couple of police officers come into the chapel. They look around a little, but they eventually leave. Pretty Boy thanks God for protecting him. Later that night, Elena and Bobby come home from church when Elena hears Carlos having a bad dream. She goes and attempts to wake him up. When he does wake up, he grabs her and pushes her against a wall. Bobby rushes downstairs and tackles Carlos. When Carlos realizes what he did, he leaves, but before he does, Elena gives him the little wooden cross that they got from the church. Carlos then goes to an overpass bridge where he is about to commit suicide. He lines up his medals and the little wooden cross on the railing. A honk from a car horn causes him to turn around where he notices someone else on the other side of the overpass that is also about to commit suicide. It is Lacey. They both see each other and Carlos says to her that he thought he was going to have some privacy, to which Lacey says she thought so too. He offers to buy her a cup of coffee, which she accepts. The next day, Bobby, an EMT, is called in to help a man pinned under some heavy equipment. After accessing the damage, Bobby knows that the man is going to die before other help can arrive. He asks the man if he knows who Jesus is. He says that he isn't sure. Bobby gives the man his little wooden cross and helps him to become a Christian before he dies. The man's wife arrives shortly after and is shocked to find the little cross in his hands. She decides to sue the department for it, claiming that Bobby withheld proper medical help unless the man accepted his religion. The chief of the department says that unless Bobby issues an apology for his actions, he will libel. Bobby refuses to apologize for his actions. That night, he tells Elena about it. She tells him to just issue an apology, to which he refuses to apologize for sharing his faith with a dying man. Elena then blows up at Bobby because he became a Christian and started going to church without consulting her first. Pretty Boy goes back for the money. When he finds it, he gets a call for Criminal, who asks him if he found the money, to which he says he didn't. Criminal urges Pretty Boy to find the money, since the drug dealer will eventually come to kill them. Pretty Boy holes up at the same motel as Maggie. He finds comfort in the Bible, which he begins reading. Maggie is staying at the motel, where she is visited by Grace. Grace offers to let Maggie stay at their place. On the way there, Maggie tells Grace about how her mother tried to get her to have an abortion, but refused to when she felt the baby kick inside of her. When Maggie asks if they have kids, Grace tells Maggie how she can't have kids. She also mentions how her and Matthew haven't adopted because they wouldn't be there for the birth. Jay and Terry lost their daughter years ago, but after hearing Matthew's sermon, Jay decides to start living their lives instead of just existing. And Terry then volunteer at a local Salvation Army soup kitchen when they come across Samantha and Lily. At first reluctant to volunteer, Terry finds a renewed energy when talking to Lily. Asks if it is okay if they have lunch with Samantha and Lily, to which Samantha accepts. As they are eating, Lily mentions how sometimes they sleep in Samantha's orange car whenever the shelter is full. That night, Jay can't sleep as he has been thinking about Samantha and her daughter. As it is raining, he deduces that the shelters are probably all full and Samantha and Lily are probably sleeping in the orange car. When he gets there, he is correct. He finds them in the orange car and offers them a place for the night. When they get there, Jay and Terry offer them their daughter's old room. Lily loves it because there's a dollhouse and because of the fact that they can sleep in a bed without having to worry about a stranger sleeping next to them. Lily says that they should both thank Jesus for taking care of them. Offers to let Samantha and Lily stay permanently, but Samantha says she'll wait and see how things go. Carlos and Lacey spend the night talking to each other. Carlos mentions how one day a friend's helicopter was shot down with an RPG, but he was unable to save him in the wreckage. This has apparently been the incident that has been haunting him. The next day, Pretty Boy goes to the church, where he thanks Joe for his help. He goes to see Pastor Matthew, where he tells him that it felt like his sermon was directed at him. He gives Matthew the duffel bag of cash, which he says he cannot accept. Pretty Boy says that if he cannot accept it, then maybe he can use it for others who need it. Matthew takes the cash and puts it by his desk. As Pretty Boy leaves the church, he is spotted by friends of Criminal. They call Criminal and tell him. After telling him about Pretty Boy leaving the church, Criminal remembers how after his aunt became saved, after seeing a TV preacher and then giving all her money to him, he figures Pretty Boy has done the same thing. He goes to the church. Matthew is on the phone with Grace, who tells him that Maggie is about to go into labor and they need someone to drive. At that moment, Criminal walks in and pulls a gun on Matthew and threatens to shoot him unless he gives him the money. Matthew hands him the cash and Criminal asks him if he believes in God. Matthew says he does, and Criminal says that he, Matthew, will see him if he pulls the trigger. Criminal decides not to kill Matthew. Bobby is about to be questioned in front of a judge when he is approached by the prosecuting attorney, Andrea Logan White. She is the attorney of the woman suing Bobby and is also Dr. Farrell's wife or girlfriend. This is never made clear. She asks why Bobby is choosing not to apologize, to which he says that he is not ashamed by what he did and that if he could, he'd do it again. She shows him the little wooden cross in a plastic evidence bag and says that this cross is gonna cost him. After the ruling, which isn't shown, Andrea tells Bobby told ya, suggesting that it did cost him. A friend of Joe's comes to Jay's house and gives Samantha the angel sculpture along with a note that says that he's in the hospital and the sculpture is for Lily. The friend informs Samantha that Joe has stage 4 leukemia. She asks the man if he can take her to the hospital to see Joe. He agrees. Says that he and Terry will watch Lily. Samantha goes to the hospital, where she talks to Joe and they have a heartbreaking conversation about how Joe went to prison, and when he was eventually released, his daughter did not wish to see him anymore, which is why he took a liking to Lily, as she reminds him of his daughter. He asks if there is any way that he can see Lily before he dies. At this point, his sickness has rapidly progressed and has a little while longer to live. Pretty Boy goes to see Criminal. Criminal asks Pretty Boy if he has the money. Pretty Boy says no. Criminal then says that it was a trick question and pulls out the duffel bag with the money. Pretty Boy tries to tell Criminal about Jesus and how he is seeing things differently now, but Criminal tells him to shut up about Jesus. He prepares to shoot Pretty Boy, but the drug dealer appears and is about to shoot Criminal, but Pretty Boy gets in front of him and is shot 3 times in the back. Criminal then knocks out the drug dealer. Pretty Boy hands his little wooden cross, which is stained with his blood, to Criminal and tells him to believe. He dies a few seconds later. The drug dealer wakes up and Criminal flees. Lacey invites Carlos up to her place, but he fears that he will hurt her like Elena, so he decides to leave. Lacey is heartbroken again. As they say their goodbyes, Carlos slips his little wooden cross into Lacey's pocket without her knowing. He then hitches a ride from a truck driver. Lacey goes to her patio and finds the little wooden cross. She then asks if he, God, is there. She says that, if he is really there, bring Carlos back to her. Criminal is running with the drug dealer behind him. It is starting to rain heavily. Criminal makes it to the overpass bridge, where he is shot in the middle of the road. A passing car swerves to miss Criminal, but runs over the drug dealer instead. The car then stops in the middle of the road. Andrea is on her phone texting and doesn't see the car ahead of her stop. She slams right into it, pushing that car into the way of oncoming traffic. That car is then hit from the side, flipping it over violently. More cars crash. Matthew is driving Grace and Maggie to the hospital when they crash into the cars as well. Terry and Lily are on their way to the hospital when they encounter the accident. They are able to stop short of the accident, but are suddenly struck from behind by another car and are sent into the guardrail, leaving the car halfway dangling over the river. Carlos and the trucker stop short of the accident. He sees the car dangling and gets out of the truck to help. He puts weight on the car to keep it from going over the edge. He breaks the back window to get Lily out. Bobby, also passing by, comes out to help, as well as some other civilians. He gets Andrea out of her car moments before it explodes. He goes to help Carlos, tells Terry to get out next. She says that she won't leave without him, but he tells her that he'll be right behind her. She gets out next. When Carlos goes for Jay tells him to leave him because his leg is broken. Carlos chooses not to and, with help, is able to get Jay out before the car goes tumbling down into the river. Maggie goes into labor and Matthew has to deliver the baby himself. The baby is successfully delivered, but Grace notices how much blood Maggie is losing. Maggie says to Grace that she now got to see the birth of her baby, implying that Maggie knows she is going to die and wants Matthew and Grace to become the parents to her baby girl. Maggie dies. Andrea goes over to see Bobby and asks him why he saved her after she ruined his life. He says we are to love our enemies and pray for them. Andrea appears to have a change of heart about how she was acting. At the hospital, Samantha and Joe are talking when he suddenly passes away before being able to see Lily. Dr. Farrell and Elena come in. Dr. Farrell signs the death certificate and leaves the room. A few minutes later, vital signs start showing on the machine for Joe. He then comes back to life. Elena rushes out of the room to get Dr. Farrell. They come back, and Dr. Farrell is stunned. Elena and Joe agree that it is a miracle, as nothing else could explain how he could come back after being dead for 8 minutes. Dr. Farrell, a skeptic, vows to look for some kind of medical explanation for it, as he refuses to believe in any kind of religious miracle. Lily comes in and hugs Joe. Gets his leg in a cast, and tells Terry that he loves her. Matthew and Grace stare at their new baby. Elena and Bobby meet at the hospital's chapel, where she apologizes to Bobby for how she was, since she now knows there is a God, after witnessing Joe's miracle. Carlos comes back to Lacey and they hug. Lacey looks up, now believing in God after her request came true. Andrea starts to read the Bible on her phone, and when Dr. Farrell comes in, she decides to leave him, since he is very anti-religious. Criminal is arrested and is at the hospital being treated when he is approached by a detective. Criminal is seen holding Pretty Boy's little wooden cross with tears in his eyes. Joe hugs Lily and Samantha, implying that they will become a family. In a final voiceover, Pastor Matthew states that this world is not perfect but cannot wait to see what God's masterpiece is. The final shot is that of the street preacher continuing down the street with the big wooden cross.